So what's the latest news on the Bath and Nort East Somerset proposals for emission-based parking for motorcycles? A couple of weeks back I went down to Keynsham, to the Keynsham Civic Centre to meet up with Bath and Nort East Somerset's parking expert in a meeting along with Jeff Mills, the political rep for the Western region of MAG, and Carenza from the British Motorcyclist Federation. So in the meeting we discussed the case for why motorcycles should be exempt from parking charges. Currently motorcycles are exempt from parking charges in all of Bath and Nort East Somerset Council's car parks and on-street parking, and we believe that that should remain the case. Their proposals are to start introducing charges for motorcycles based on their tailpipe emissions to bring that in line with the current policy for cars. The problems that we've got though are that the data that they're using, or the evidence that they're using to justify this, is clearly non-existent. We went in to explain the case for keeping motorcycles exempt, and frankly all they did was sat there and say, yes, that's very interesting, you should put it in your consultation response. But what they didn't do is really present any evidence to justify introducing the charges for motorcycles. Now, we had asked for this meeting to take place before the consultation started. We were refused that, said that we couldn't have a meeting until the consultation had been launched. The reasons seemed to be that they wanted to make sure that we were looking at all the evidence that they were going to provide in that consultation process. The problem is there wasn't really any evidence to justify the charges for motorcycles in that consultation pack. So I was quite interested to ask questions about what evidence they do actually have.
What's your evidence?
And it might surprise you to hear that the answer was basically, no, we don't have any evidence.
The problem is we don't have any evidence.
I asked them how many motorcycles park in their parking at the moment. They don't have any data on that.
I have no idea.
I asked them how much air pollution is emitted by motorcycles in the area. They don't have any data on that.
I have no idea.
I asked them how much revenue they expected to generate by charging motorcycles. They don't have any data on that.
I have no idea.
So they don't seem to have much data on anything when it comes to justifying this charge for motorcycles. So I asked for an explanation as to why they were using CO2 as the measure of air pollution that was being created by vehicles as opposed to the actual NOx that is emitted from the tailpipe. As we know, the clean air zones and London's ULEZ, ultra-low emission zone, all the information is based around the amount of NOx that is emitted from the tailpipe as opposed to the amount of CO2 that is emitted from the tailpipe. And obviously London settled on pre-Euro 3 machines emitting too much air pollutant. Of course, in London we did demonstrate that over 75% of the vehicles that are pre-Euro 3 actually meet Euro 3 levels of emissions. So, you know, even if they were going to use the Euro rating, that wouldn't be a valid case for actual emissions. Bath and Nort East Somerset Council are choosing to go with CO2 emissions as opposed to NOx emissions. What's the answer for that? The answer is that they don't have access to the Euro rating information for vehicles. That database isn't something that they are allowed to access when introducing parking charges, but they can use the CO2 emissions of a vehicle. Now, the difficulty with this is, as we've discovered from a Freedom of Information request that was submitted to the DVLA, and many thanks to Rob Hinks, I think it was, who actually did the Freedom of Information request. What we now know is that the DVLA does not possess information on the CO2 emissions of 91.5% of all registered motorcycles in the country. Yes, that's right. We've got a database that basically has no information on the vast majority of bikes in the country being used to determine how much CO2 is emitted by bikes.
I have no idea.
Now what this means from a motorcyclist perspective is that the vast majority of motorcyclists in Bath and Nort East Somerset will be charged based on their engine capacity. And as we all know, what Bath and Nort East Somerset are saying is bike over 600cc maps onto a car that is over 3 litres. Totally ridiculous, totally unreasonable.
That's not reasonable. That's the opposite of reasonable.
So what we do know from this Freedom of Information request is that 84% of the motorcycles where they do know the CO2 emissions actually fall within the first band of the emission bands that Bath and Nort East Somerset Council intend to use. And the remainder, almost all of them, fall into the second category. Now you might say that the CO2 emissions for bikes are going to become better known, and over a period of time more and more bikes will have CO2 emission figures held by the DVLA. But again, this Freedom of Information request shows to us that they didn't start collecting this information until around 2017, 2018, and since then the maximum number of bikes where they've got the CO2 emissions in any one year is about 20%. If you look at bikes registered so far this year, it is less than 20% where they hold the CO2 emission figures. So this isn't a case of an improving data set, it's a data set that is going to be deficient for the foreseeable future. You have to ask yourself, what is it that Bath and Nort East Somerset are doing here? They've got a policy which seems to be based on dogma rather than common sense. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that is being used to justify it. And indeed, if you look at their parking strategy, Bath and Nort East Somerset's own parking strategy, they talk about motorcycles, and what they say is the use of motorcycles is increasingly popular due to their ability to bypass congestion, fuel efficiency and ease of parking. They also produce significantly lower emissions than cars, so have a positive impact on air quality as well as congestion levels. So their own policy states that they know that motorcycles produce less emissions than cars, and yet the plan is to charge them as much, or in 91.5% of cases, vastly higher than that they would be charging for the equivalent emissions from a car. This is just ridiculous. It's contradictory. It doesn't meet their own policy statement, and yet they're pushing this through. And what it looks like is this is a decision based purely on dogma. This comment from the councillor saying that there is no safe level of emissions.
Although there's limits, there is no safe level. Everywhere has an air quality problem. There is no safe level for pollution. It's absolutely wrong to say that anywhere can hand on heart say there is no air pollution issue, because that's just not the case.
It's an absolutist statement. So it's an absolutist policy as opposed to a realistic policy. And what's the impact going to be? Well, I rode down to the meeting on my 865cc motorcycle. The DVLA, unsurprisingly, doesn't hold the CO2 emissions figures for that bike. It didn't take me very long to research on Google that it actually emits 113 grams per kilometre. Now, my alternative was to have driven down in a car. Now, my car is relatively environmentally friendly, shall we say. It's a 1 litre EcoBoost Ford engine, which emits 115 grams per kilometre. But that is 2 grams per kilometre more than the bike. And yet, when I got there, the charge for the car would have been in the lowest parking charge band, because it emits less than 130 grams of CO2. But the bike, being an 865cc bike, would be charged in the highest band. So they're actively discouraging me from riding the more environmentally friendly, less polluting, less congesting motorcycle by charging me more to park my motorcycle than they would be charging me to park my car.
That's not reasonable. That's the opposite of reasonable.
So what is the impact of this policy going to be? They've got no way of measuring it, to be fair. They've got no data of how many motorcycles park in their car parks at the moment. They will have no way of measuring whether or not the charges are improving or decreasing the quality of the air in the area. There is no evidence base for introducing this policy, and there will be no evidence base that we can use to actually measure the effectiveness of the policy in terms of meeting its stated goal. This is dogma-based policy. It is not based on evidence, and yet we're led to believe that they're going to listen to all the evidence that we supply when we do a consultation response.
Of course we will, sweetheart.
The evidence that we supply is not going to be anything that they shouldn't already know. In fact, we've got evidence to show that they do already know it, because they actually state it in their parking policy that motorcycles have significantly lower emissions than cars. So how can they therefore come up with a pricing policy that charges motorcycles more than it does cars? There's no logic being applied to here. It is pure and utter dogma. Now the consultation ends shortly. It ends at, I think, 5 o'clock on the 8th of August. If you're seeing this video before then, please do respond to that consultation if you get the chance. And what I would suggest you do is not waste too much time trying to provide the evidence, trying to make the argument. Just explain to them what behaviour change the parking charges are likely to bring in terms of your activity. Are you going to ride your motorcycle into Bath and Nort East Somerset and park it up and pay more to park than you would your car, or are you actually going to drive into Bath and Nort East Somerset with your car? In effect, what you need to do is explain that by introducing these charges, they will actually be increasing the amount of pollution and emissions from the transport system by encouraging use of the more polluting vehicle. This is not logical, it is not sensible, and we need to put a stop to it. Now, unfortunately, the final decision will be made on this policy not by a vote by the entire council, but by the decision of one particular councillor. The councillor who believes that motorcycles these days are as big as cars.
It's about motorbikes. Increasingly, motorbikes are of a size that means that they take up a full bay or a full space, so we're looking to charge them as well.
I mean, that's patently nonsense.
The councillor who believes that there is no safe level of air pollution and is not prepared to listen to any evidence, clearly.
Although there's limits, there is no safe level. Everywhere has an air quality problem. There is no safe level for pollution. It's absolutely wrong to say that anywhere can hand on heart say there is no air pollution issue, because that's just not the case.
So it's not looking too good, but we'll have to wait until probably, I think it's going to be the end of September that the decision is made, and then we will decide what action we take if they make the wrong decision. And yes, when I say the wrong decision, I really do mean they make the wrong decision. This isn't about making the decision that we want to hear. This is actually about them making a wrong decision that will actually increase the amount of air pollution in Bath and North East Somerset, not decrease it.
We have our public consultation where people will be able to input their thoughts, and we genuinely read every single one of them, and we encourage everyone to come in with their thoughts about how we can do some of this stuff. The outcome of a TRO and a consultation is going to be in advance. Consultation, we will see what people think. That's why we do a consultation, and these aren't sham consultations. We do consultations to listen to what people feel is better, and then make the balanced decision based on all the input we get.